There is no shortage of conflict these days between Christians who share different opinions about critical race theory. Some think CRT is a direct message from Satan, others think CRT is a good framework for helping Christians engage the culture. Still others think that CRT is a perfect reflection of the gospel mission given by Jesus himself. So in the end, there's a lot of conflict. So what I want to do in this short series of videos is start a dialogue between Christian brothers and sisters in hopes of discerning where CRT fits within our Christian worldview. So to start things off, this video is a very short introduction to the philosophical ancestor of critical race theory that we all know and love as critical theory. Well, critical theory finds its roots really in this Frankfurt school in Germany during the 1920s. So at this school, you really had a bunch of Marxist philosophers and sociologists, guys like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse. And these guys were really unhappy. They were dissatisfied with the slow progress of communism. I mean, communism was promising revolution, a change, but it just wasn't coming. And so these guys said, hey, we have to have a faster way of getting this change. Now, really after there, it's where the waters get a little bit murky. So there's this great primer on Amazon that you can get on critical theory. And I like this because it gives a lot of pictures that are easy to kind of understand and try to simplify a lot of the complexities behind this so we can understand. So what this primer shows is, look, all these different movements and people that kind of work together, not just to form critical theory, but also critical race theory that we'll look at in another video. So as we zoom in, we see there's all these different movements: the Enlightenment, French Revolution, utopian socialism, romanticism, modernism, all these things through different times, different people back them, all kind of influencing the way different philosophers understood things like economics and philosophy. But a lot of this comes to a head in a guy, Karl Marx, who had all these influencers like Kant and Hegel and Herder, and then his ideas were taken up and modified and used by a lot of other people in a lot of other movements. Now, to make it even a little more complex, throw in postmodernism, which really took shape in the 1960s, early 1970s. And you get these different movements like for feminism and Black critical studies that take shape at this time. And they start influencing a lot of different post-Marxist or neo-Marxist ideas, along with other structuralists and all these different movements and ideas and philosophies. But the big key is how all these shape things like science and our physics and our biology. And so our educational systems began to be influenced by these thinkers, which is just sort of a natural part of the process. But here we see a guy like Charles Darwin, where his theories of materialistic evolution and biology started to have huge impact on the sciences, but also ultimately then in areas of psychology through men like Sigmund Freud. And then finally, you throw in, again, that sort of idea of cultural materialism or philosophical naturalism, as some might call it. And these are all the influences and thinking that go behind a lot of critical theory. So ultimately, this is a great short definition. Critical theory is an activist philosophy that promotes freedom and liberation, not just from physical or economic bondage, but from oppressive cultural ideas and values. And that in and of itself sounds good, right? I mean, we want an activist, we want to make changes in the world around us, but we have to look at some of the underpinnings behind this to really evaluate, can this fit in with the Christian worldview? So here we have a great book on critical theory that could be used as a textbook anywhere, many schools. But what it does is it puts a little bit of feet to that philosophy and say, okay, well, how does critical theory hope to shape? How does that activism actually work to shape society? Well, here's what the author says. If religion produces a situation in which humanity is dominated by the products of its brain, which is what Marx learned from Ludwig Feuerbach, then under capitalism, humanity is dominated by the products of its hands. So we start to see that critical theory is a very holistic way of looking at the world, because it's giving a justification for why religion and economics can be used as oppressive forms to shape society, and why these have to be, in essence, overthrown if we want real change to happen. So what then are the keys to understanding critical theory? Well, first we got to know, is CT a worldview? Well, here's my short definition. A worldview is a lens we use to interpret the world and focus our observations into a clear narrative that answers the questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And in this definition, I would say yes, critical theory itself is a worldview because it tries to answer those four basic areas: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. So let me try to illustrate this through this little chart. On the left, you have this vertical bar that has the words was, is, and will be. And this is representing the fact that the past, present, and future, all of those things are within the same domain. They're all a part of the material, natural world. There is no distinction between those realities. There's no immaterial reality. There's no spiritual realm. There's no world outside. All of these things are material. And so with that framework, they try to answer these key questions that are part of anybody's worldview. How did I come into being? What is the purpose for life? What is the right thing to do? How can I fulfill my purpose? How will my legacy be judged? And what happens when I die? So let's just unpack each one of those very quickly and show why CT is really a worldview. So the first one we'll look at is the question of origin, or in philosophy we might say metaphysics or ontology. So let me just ask this question. What does CT accept as truth or reality? And I'm going to use those interchangeably here in this video. Well, some people look at truth or reality as transcendent or absolute. These are realities that may emanate from God himself. So an example of a transcendent Christian truth would be human persons are intrinsically sacred. Now, outside of these transcendent or absolute truths, we have these sort of immanent or transient truths. And inside that, we can break it down. We have contingent truths. These are things that we discover through science, through empirical observation, that we can falsify or verify through these scientific methodologies. For example, saying the sky is blue. That's a contingent type of truth. And then we have synthetic truth, where these are the things that are propositions that come apart as a society. We have these competition for ideas, and individuals come together and they form a culture, and this culture has a shared narrative or a shared truth. And for example, the question or the assertion, we should end slavery, is really a synthetic truth. And then we have what might follow as subjective truth. These are propositions or statements that are purely internal to the person. So the truth, I like peanut butter, is true for me, but it may not be true for you, but yet it is still a truth. Now, there's all kinds of systems that exist for dividing up who accepts what as truth or their reality. We have relativism, we have postmodernism, scientism, presuppositionalism, and then there's what I propose as sort of a revised correspondence theory of truth. But critical to this study of CT is that they draw a strong line right here at this point between transcendent and immanent truth. There is no truth outside the immanent, or this transient truth. And we express it in CT through these terms like a narrative and construct. So you hear these terms like, hey, that's your narrative, or we talk about a social construct. Those are issues, those are words that are really used to describe these issues that we deal with when we say what constitutes truth or reality. So here we are back to our primer, and what it's saying here in this book is that narrative, or these social constructs that we have, are only good if they don't try to impose any sort of universal truth or universal reality on anybody. They work for individuals or small groups, but as soon as we try to apply them broadly to constrain or dominate other narratives, then they become oppressive. So we see this idea that narrative itself is this basic human construction. It's something we invent, and we don't need anything outside of that. We don't need a God. We don't need an immaterial reality. We don't need anything that transcends us, our experience, or the cultural experience to know that our narrative is true, because we decide what is truth. So now let's head back here to my little chart that illustrates this. Here we are again. We're with this idea of was and is and will be all existing within the material realm. And so when we take the idea of metaphysics or ontology, the nature of being, I guess the way I would say it is it's physics now. It's all purely the world around us. So metaphysics really becomes physics. So when we ask that question, how did I come into being? Critical theory would say, well, it's through natural processes of cosmic and biological evolution. Okay, well, let's move on. What about CT and the question of meaning? Or we might say epistemology. How do we know what is true? Or how do we know what we should even count as truth? Again, we're back to our primer, and we see that according to CT, there is no final source of knowing. There is no final authoritative truth that doesn't change with time, culture, perception, and power. So the idea of knowing is completely always under this revisionist process. This sort of Hegelian dialect of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And because of that, we say that, look, if there's any time when we think a fact can tell us something different than the narrative, if a fact can give us this absolute truth, or a fact can tell us something that's absolute, then it's a lie, because no facts can ever divest us of what we know as our own personal construct or our social construct. Okay, so what does this say then about how we discover truth? Well, that's where we can turn to somebody like W.V.O. Quine, who's writing in the 20th century, and he says this: why all this make-believe? The stimulation of the sensory receptors is all the evidence anybody has to go on, ultimately in arriving at the picture of the world. Why not just settle for psychology? So what he's saying is, look, epistemology, the search for truth, the discovery of truth, is just about our psychology. It's just about, if we can understand how the brain works, if we can study the brain, we'll understand how we define and what truth is. So let's take that back to our worldview chart. And here we have, okay, epistemology then becomes psychology. So if epistemology is psychology, we try to answer, what is the purpose for my life? Well, it's biologically informed and established by the state, or that is the cultural consensus. Looking into the future, again, we take psychology, and when we answer that question, how will my legacy be judged? Well, the answer is based on one's abilities. Your biological condition helps you know what maybe you should do, but how do those biological abilities help you serve the purpose of the state? And this is critical for critical theory. So let me just take these last two areas of morality and destiny together, because I think with the quotes we've already seen, this gives us enough of a framework to answer these two aspects of a worldview, to see where CT would go and why it answers these questions the way it does. So here we're back at our chart. Now we're going to add this idea of ethics, or what I'll just say is absolute ethics. And that just is mostly to help us build a contrast here, because there is no such thing as an absolute ethics. Ethics are really consensual. They're agreed upon by the culture, and that's the only framework for doing ethics. So when we ask the question, what is the right thing to do? Well, we have to say, well, I'm informed by my feelings, but those have to also be ratified again by the state, by that cultural narrative, the cultural consensus. Well, now let's add in the question of sociopraxy, the way we live out our worldview, our CT ethic, so to speak. What is the politics? What's the way we treat one another? So when we apply this and answer that question, how can I fulfill my purpose? Well, CT would tell us that you fulfill the goal of race, class, gender liberation, as again determined by the state, the cultural consensus. And then we're back to the future and back to physics. Metaphysics is gone, we're back to physics, and we ask this question: what happens when I die? Well, death is the end of your consciousness, but the state lives on. And that's all that really matters, is because the individual is really an illusion. What matters is the collective conscious of the state. And so that's why your life and goals are to serve that of the state, because that's the only thing that has lasting power and effect. So with that very short review of the history of CT, the question comes up: is CT compatible with the Christian worldview? So here's what CT would say, and this is what I want to contrast here. So within CT, there's this idea that whoever's in the majority, they have the power, and they control the narrative. And it's natural. It's within the nature, the biological nature of humans, to dominate when they have the power. And so power really isn't about repressing people or oppressing people. It's about controlling the power of knowledge. And so when a group gets in power, they not only oppress, they tell you what counts as truth. And so they want to deny your narrative, CT says. And because there's no external ultimate reality outside to give us a worldview, because a worldview is denied, that meta-narrative is denied, it's only competing narratives. And so if you are of the oppressed group, everything that dominant group uses, whether it's reason or logic, they're using that to oppress you. And therefore, the only way to throw off the oppression is to take the power from them, take control of these sources of knowing. And this, I'd say, is why CT is completely incompatible with a Christian worldview. Because, see, for the Christian, a worldview is necessary to overcome these false narratives, or what might be called hegemonic powers. So ultimately, the CT value of narrative or construct denies the transcultural truth, denies transcultural ethical norms that Christianity relies upon, knowing that God is our creator and what he's given us as the mission and purpose for our faith. So Walker Percy kind of addresses this issue. Now his context is a little bit different. He talks about science versus faith as sources of truth. But I think the principle here, he says, it holds true. He says that, look, it's a disaster when we only accept one kind of truth. In other words, if CT is only accepting the immanent or transient truth and denying the transcendent truth, what appears reasonable within the culture may end up destroying human life to attain those goals. And you think, well, maybe that's an overstatement. That's not going to happen. But it is the case. And it is what happens within critical theory. And I think that's the case of what we see is going to happen in critical race theory. All right, so there you have it. A very short, if not dizzying history of critical theory. Certainly a lot you can use to start a dialogue with some friends. Now, in the next set of videos, I'll start to look at the distinctives of critical race theory that set it apart from critical theory and how that fits within a Christian worldview.